Ethan, a 15-year-old boy with a calm demeanor and simple clothes, stood at the entrance of a luxurious car dealership. The bright showroom windows displayed high-end vehicles gleaming under the spotlights. His heart raced with excitement, yet his outward appearance remained composed. He had been saving up for this moment, the day he could finally step inside and choose his first car. Ethan wasn't like other boys his age. While most were busy with school and friends, Ethan had inherited a strong sense of responsibility from his late father. Every penny he earned, he saved, waiting for the perfect moment. And today, that moment had come. As he walked slowly toward the entrance, his eyes scanned each car meticulously. The shine of the polished Ferraris and Lamborghinis caught his attention, but he focused on a more modest model parked near the back. That one seems practical, he whispered to himself, scratching his head. Yet, doubt lingered in his mind. But what if I need something bigger? If my friends come along, or if I want to travel far? His mind raced with possibilities, and he knew this was a decision he couldn't make lightly. Inside the dealership, the air was filled with the quiet hum of soft music and murmured conversations. Wealthy customers wandered around, admiring the luxury vehicles with their polished exteriors and leather interiors. Behind a large desk sat Paul, a tall, middle-aged salesman with perfectly combed hair and an air of superiority. He had been working at the dealership for years and was known for his selective attention to potential buyers. As soon as he noticed Ethan approaching, Paul's face twisted into a smirk. "Hey, kid," Paul called out, his voice dripping with sarcasm as he walked toward Ethan. "The toy store is down the street. This place is for serious buyers, not kids like you." His eyes swept over Ethan's worn-out sneakers and simple hoodie. The words hit like a cold slap, but Ethan remained silent, keeping his composure as Paul stood in front of him, arms crossed, waiting for a reaction. Ethan didn't flinch. Instead, he continued to examine the cars, taking in every detail. Paul, however, wasn't done. He let out a chuckle, louder this time, ensuring others in the showroom could hear. "You think you can walk in here and buy one of these?" he sneered, gesturing toward a gleaming sports car nearby. "Look at you. You don't belong here." Despite the insults, Ethan remained calm. His eyes shifted from car to car, ignoring the growing hostility from the salesman. He knew he didn't have to explain himself. His confidence wasn't dependent on Paul's approval. Ethan walked deeper into the showroom, his gaze landing on a sleek, red Ferrari, admiring its compact design. He didn't need Paul's permission to dream or plan for his future. From across the room, Sophie, a kind-hearted employee who had been watching the entire scene unfold, frowned. She knew Paul's reputation for treating people based on their appearances, and it always bothered her. Today was no different. She decided to step in, knowing it was risky. Approaching slowly, she caught Paul's eye and said, "That's enough, Paul. Let him be. Everyone has the right to look around." Paul rolled his eyes, clearly irritated by Sophie's interference. "He's wasting our time," he grumbled. "You don't actually think this kid can afford any of these cars, do you? He's just playing pretend." Paul turned back to Ethan, his eyes narrowing. "Listen, kid, we don't have time for window shoppers. If you're not buying, you need to leave." Ethan finally met Paul's gaze, calm as ever. "I'm just looking for now, but I'll be making a decision soon." His voice was soft but firm, a quiet strength that caught both Paul and Sophie by surprise. Paul scoffed, but before he could say anything more, Sophie stepped forward, her hand resting gently on Ethan's shoulder. "Take your time, Ethan," Sophie said kindly, ignoring the glare Paul shot her way. "If you need any help or have questions, I'm here." Her tone was warm, inviting, and in stark contrast to the cold hostility Paul had shown. Ethan smiled at her, appreciating the gesture, even though he didn't yet fully understand why she was so kind. As Ethan continued to explore the cars, Paul fumed silently in the background. He couldn't stand that Sophie had undermined his authority, and he was certain this kid was wasting their time. But Ethan paid no attention to Paul's simmering anger. Instead, He focused on the cars, thinking carefully about what he truly needed. Sophie watched Ethan with curiosity. There was something about him that intrigued her, something beyond the simple clothes and quiet demeanor. He had an air of determination, a silent confidence that wasn't easily shaken, even by someone as rude as Paul. She couldn't help but wonder who this boy really was. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity to Paul, but felt like a few peaceful moments to Ethan, he made his way back toward the entrance. Sophie, still standing near the cars, offered him a smile. "I hope you found something you liked," she said, her voice gentle. Ethan nodded, returning her smile. "I did," he replied, "and I'll be back soon." There was a quiet certainty in his words that made Sophie believe him, even though Paul rolled his eyes behind them. As Ethan walked out of the dealership, the sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the city. He felt a sense of satisfaction, not because of the cars he had seen, but because he had remained true to himself. Even in the face of judgment, tomorrow, he knew, would be another day, one where the world would begin to see him for who he truly was. The following day, Ethan stood in front of the dealership once again. This time, the air felt different. He knew what to expect and had prepared himself mentally for whatever Paul might throw his way. Dressed in the same simple clothes, he walked through the glass doors, keeping his head high. The memories of yesterday's encounter with Paul didn't weigh him down. Instead, they fueled his quiet determination. He wasn't here for anyone's approval. Ethan was here to make a choice that was his and his alone. As soon as Ethan stepped inside, he noticed the tension in the air. Paul was standing near the desk, chatting with another customer, but his eyes immediately locked onto Ethan. The smirk from yesterday returned to Paul's face, only this time it seemed colder, more calculated. He excused himself from the conversation and walked straight toward Ethan, his steps heavy with intent. "Well, well," Paul said mockingly, crossing his arms as he stood in front of the boy. "Look who's back. Didn't I tell you to take your little daydreams somewhere else?" He paused, his eyes sweeping over Ethan's modest appearance once again. "Or maybe you didn't get the message yesterday." His voice was full of disdain, echoing through the otherwise quiet showroom. Ethan, calm as ever, didn't flinch. "I'm just here to look again," he said, keeping his voice steady. He wasn't here for a confrontation, but he also wasn't going to back down. This was a place of business, and he had every right to be there. He began walking past Paul, heading toward the same row of cars he had admired the day before. Paul's irritation flared. He couldn't understand why this kid didn't seem to be affected by his words. Most people would have left by now, embarrassed or ashamed. But Ethan wasn't most people. Paul felt his temper rising, and his voice grew louder. "You must really like wasting time, don't you? Because that's all you're doing here." He moved quickly, stepping in front of Ethan and blocking his path. "Listen, kid," Paul growled. "We don't have time for people who can't afford to buy. You're just in the way." Before Ethan could respond, Sophie, who had been watching the exchange from a distance, quickly made her way over. She had hoped Paul would leave Ethan alone today, but clearly, things were only getting worse. "Paul, stop it," Sophie said firmly, her voice cutting through the tension. "This is enough. He has every right to be here, just like anyone else." Paul shot her a look of disbelief. "Are you serious?" he snapped. "Look at him. He's not a buyer. He's just some kid playing around. We can't let people like him hang around and drive away real customers." His frustration was clear, and he was determined not to let Ethan slip by without another confrontation. But Sophie wasn't backing down. "Everyone deserves to be treated with respect," she said, her voice steady but filled with conviction. "You're judging him without knowing anything about him. That's not how we should treat people." She turned to Ethan, offering a kind smile. "If you need any help, just let me know, okay?" Ethan nodded, grateful for her support, though he could sense that Paul wasn't going to give up so easily. "Thank you, Sophie," he said, appreciating her kindness amidst the hostility. He glanced back at Paul, who was standing there fuming, and added calmly, I'm just here to look around. I won't take much of your time." Paul's patience had clearly run out. "You're wasting everyone's time," he muttered through gritted teeth, taking a step toward Ethan. His tone was darker now, almost threatening. "Get out before I have you thrown out." At that moment, something inside Ethan shifted. He had been patient, understanding even, but this was too far. Without raising his voice, he met Paul's gaze, his calmness more unsettling than any display of anger could have been. "I'll leave when I'm ready," he said simply. "And that's not for you to decide." Sophie, sensing the confrontation was escalating, quickly stepped between them. "Paul, that's enough," she said, her voice sharp. "You can't keep treating people like this. If Mr. Daniels knew how you were behaving, he'd—" Paul cut her off with a harsh laugh. "Mr. Daniels," he scoffed. "Mr. Daniels wouldn't care about some kid walking around like he owns the place. This is a luxury dealership, Sophie. We're not here to hand out free tours." But Sophie stood her ground. "You don't know what Mr. Daniels would think, and you don't know anything about Ethan either. Just let him be." For a moment, Paul stared at her, his eyes filled with contempt. Then, without a word, he turned and stormed back to the front desk, leaving Sophie and Ethan standing there in the middle of the showroom. The tension in the air slowly began to dissipate, though it still lingered, like a storm that had yet to fully pass. Ethan let out a quiet sigh of relief. "Thank you," he said softly, looking at Sophie with genuine gratitude. "I didn't mean to cause trouble." Sophie shook her head, her expression warm and understanding. "You didn't cause any trouble. Paul's the one with the problem, not you." She paused for a moment, then added, "But can I ask you something? Why do you keep coming back? You seem different from most people who walk in here." Ethan hesitated, unsure how to explain everything in a way that would make sense. He had his reasons, deep, personal reasons that went beyond just wanting to buy a car. But for now, he kept it simple. "I'm here because I have a plan," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "And I won't let people like Paul stop me." Sophie nodded, sensing that there was more to Ethan's story than he was letting on. But she didn't press him for details. Instead, she smiled and said, "Well, I'm glad you came back. If you need help with anything, just let me know." As Ethan turned to leave the dealership, he couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. On one hand, Paul's words stung. But on the other hand, Sophie's kindness reminded him that there were still people who believed in treating others with respect. And that was enough to keep him going. As he stepped out into the afternoon sun, Ethan knew one thing for certain. He would be back. And next time, things would be different. The day had arrived. Ethan stood in front of the dealership once again, but this time, he was different. Dressed in a tailored suit that fit him perfectly, with polished shoes that gleamed in the morning sun, Ethan felt a new sense of power. He hadn't changed on the inside. His calm, composed demeanor remained, but his outward appearance was now one of wealth and authority. He had carefully chosen this moment, knowing exactly what he wanted to achieve. As he entered the dealership, heads turned. The same luxury cars lined the showroom floor, but now, it wasn't just the vehicles that caught attention. It was him. The staff, who had ignored him before, now glanced his way, their expressions curious and intrigued. Paul, sitting behind the front desk, barely noticed at first. He was busy sorting through paperwork, but when he looked up and saw Ethan walking toward him, dressed in fine clothes, his mouth dropped open in shock. For a moment, Paul couldn't place where he had seen the boy before. The transformation was so complete that it took a few seconds for the recognition to settle in. When it did, his expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. What are you doing here?" Paul stammered, his voice laced with both irritation and uncertainty. He stood up from his desk, adjusting his tie nervously. Ethan walked confidently past him without saying a word, heading straight for the red Ferrari he had admired on his first visit. He stopped in front of the car, letting his fingers lightly graze the smooth, polished surface. It was as if he had been waiting for this exact moment to assert himself. Paul, still trying to process what was happening, followed close behind, his usual air of superiority now replaced with hesitation. "Wait a minute," Paul called out, his voice faltering as he approached. "What is this? Are you playing some kind of game?" His eyes darted between Ethan's expensive suit and the Ferrari. "You think you can just walk in here like this after what happened?" Ethan finally turned to face him, his expression calm but filled with purpose. "I told you I'd be back," he said simply, his voice steady and composed. "I'm here to buy this car." Paul blinked, clearly caught off guard. You're serious?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "But yesterday he stopped himself, realizing how foolish it would sound to bring up the previous encounters now that Ethan was standing there in front of him, looking every bit the wealthy customer. Sophie, who had been working near the service desk, noticed the exchange and immediately recognized Ethan. She had known there was something different about him, something more beneath the surface. But even she hadn't expected this. Quickly, she made her way over, her heart racing as she pieced together the situation. "Ethan," she called out softly, approaching him with a mix of surprise and curiosity. "Is that really you?" Ethan smiled warmly at her. "It's me, Sophie," he said, his voice gentle. "I told you I'd come back, and I meant it." Paul, still standing between them, looked back and forth in confusion. "What is going on here?" he demanded, though his voice lacked the authority it once held. "Who are you, really?" His frustration was palpable, as if the entire scenario was slipping from his control. Ethan took a deep breath, ready to reveal the truth. "My name is Ethan Sterling," he said, his eyes locking with Paul's. "My father is James Sterling, the primary investor in this dealership." His words hung in the air like a bombshell, the weight of the revelation sinking in slowly. Paul's face turned pale as the name registered. James Sterling, the man who had funded the dealership, the man whose money kept the place running smoothly, was Ethan's father. Suddenly, everything made sense. The confidence, the calmness, the way Ethan had returned despite Paul's hostility. Paul had underestimated him in every possible way. I didn't know," Paul stuttered, trying to find his footing. "I didn't realize who you were." Ethan nodded, his expression still calm. "That's exactly the point, Paul. You didn't bother to find out. You judged me based on my appearance, on what you thought I could or couldn't afford. But you never asked who I was. You never treated me with the respect that every person deserves." Sophie stood quietly, watching the scene unfold. She had known that Ethan was different, but hearing his full story now only deepened her respect for him. Paul, on the other hand, was crumbling under the weight of his own arrogance. His eyes flicked nervously between Ethan and Sophie, as if searching for a way out of the situation, but there was none. I'm sorry," Paul mumbled, though his words lacked sincerity. "I didn't mean to. I was just doing my job." "No," Ethan interrupted, his voice firm but not unkind. "You weren't doing your job. Your job is to treat every customer with respect, no matter how they look. That's what this dealership was built on, integrity and fairness. My father made sure of that, but you forgot that along the way." Paul opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. The truth was undeniable, and there was nothing he could say to defend himself. Turning to Sophie, Ethan's expression softened. "You were the only one who treated me like a person," he said sincerely. "You didn't know who I was, but you still treated me with kindness. And for that, I'm grateful." Sophie smiled, though she was still processing everything. "I just did what I thought was right," she said softly. "I couldn't stand by and let you be treated that way." Ethan nodded. "That's why I'm going to buy this car," he said, gesturing to the Ferrari. "But it's not for me." He paused, looking at Sophie with a knowing smile. "It's for you." Sophie's eyes widened in shock. "For me?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Ethan, I can't. That's too much." But Ethan shook his head. "It's not too much. It's what you deserve. You treated me with respect when no one else did. and I want to repay that kindness." For a moment, Sophie was speechless. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. A gift of this magnitude from someone she barely knew, it felt overwhelming. But as she looked into Ethan's eyes, she saw that his offer was genuine. He wasn't trying to show off or prove anything. He simply wanted to give back to someone who had shown him kindness. Paul, still standing nearby, watched the exchange in stunned silence. Everything he had thought about Ethan was wrong, and now, he was paying the price for his arrogance. He knew there was no way out of this. His actions had caught up with him, and there was no escaping the consequences. As Ethan and Sophie continued their conversation, the tension in the room began to shift. What had started as a confrontation had turned into something entirely different, a moment of understanding, of humility, and of kindness. Ethan had shown that true power didn't come from wealth or status, but from how you treated others. And with that, the truth had finally been revealed. The silence that followed Ethan's revelation seemed to stretch on for an eternity. Sophie stood frozen, her eyes wide with disbelief. She hadn't fully processed what Ethan had just said. A car, a Ferrari, no less for her? It was incomprehensible. She glanced at the sleek red vehicle, then back at Ethan, her mind reeling. "Ethan, I don't know what to say," Sophie stammered, her voice trembling slightly. "You can't give me this car. It's too much. I don't deserve it." But Ethan shook his head, his calm smile unwavering. "Yes, you do, Sophie," he said, his voice steady but warm. "You treated me with kindness when you didn't have to. You didn't know who I was, and you didn't care. That's exactly why you deserve this. I want to show you that your actions mattered." His words hung in the air like a promise, filled with genuine appreciation. Sophie felt a lump rise in her throat. She had always believed in treating people with respect, regardless of who they were or what they had. But never in her wildest dreams did she imagine that such a simple act of kindness would lead to something like this. "But Ethan, this is too big," she protested gently, her hands fidgeting nervously. "I'm just doing my job. I didn't do anything extraordinary." Ethan's smile softened. "That's where you're wrong, Sophie," he said. "What you did was extraordinary, because it's rare. Most people, like Paul, judge others based on their appearances. They don't take the time to see the person beneath the surface. But you did, and that's why this gift is for you." He paused, glancing at the car for a moment. It's not just about the car. It's about recognizing the good in others and rewarding that. Sophie still felt conflicted, her emotions swirling between gratitude and disbelief. She had spent years working at the dealership, struggling to make ends meet, raising her 2 children on her own, and never asking for much in return. This gift, this incredible gesture, felt almost too surreal. I don't know if I can accept this," she whispered, her voice shaking slightly. "It feels like too much." Ethan took a step closer, his expression kind but firm. "Sophie, you've worked hard your entire life. You've given so much to others, including me. Now it's time for someone to give back to you." He smiled again, a gentle reassurance in his eyes. "Let me do this for you. You deserve it." Sophie swallowed hard, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill over. She had never been the type to cry, especially not in front of customers or colleagues. But Ethan's words touched her in a way that few things ever had. She could feel the sincerity behind his offer, and in that moment, she realized that this wasn't just about the car. It was about the respect he was showing her, the value he saw in her actions. Before Sophie could respond, Paul, who had been standing off to the side, still trying to comprehend the situation, suddenly spoke up. His voice was filled with a mixture of disbelief and frustration. "This is ridiculous," he exclaimed, throwing his hands up in the air. "You're seriously going to give her a car? A Ferrari? For what? Being nice?" Ethan turned to face Paul, his expression calm but firm. "Yes, Paul, for being nice. For treating people with respect, regardless of how they look. That's something you clearly don't understand." His words were sharp, But there was no anger behind them, just a simple truth that Paul had yet to grasp. Paul's face turned red with frustration. "You can't just," he began, but Sophie, finding her voice again, cut him off. "Paul, stop," Sophie said, her tone steady but firm. "This isn't about you. Ethan has made his decision, and it's not your place to question it." She glanced at Ethan, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I didn't expect this, but I'm grateful. And if Ethan believes I deserve this, then maybe it's time I start believing it too." Paul stared at Sophie, stunned into silence. For once, he had nothing to say. The power dynamic that had always defined their working relationship had shifted, and for the first time, Paul was the one left feeling powerless. Ethan watched the exchange quietly, his expression thoughtful. He knew that Paul's arrogance and pride were deeply rooted, but he also knew that people could change if they were willing to see the truth. "Paul," Ethan said, his voice softer now, "this could have been you. It could have been anyone in this dealership. But you chose to judge me based on my appearance. That's the difference between you and Sophie." She didn't let her assumptions get in the way of treating someone with kindness. Paul opened his mouth as if to respond, but no words came. Instead, he turned away, his shoulders tense with the weight of his own mistakes. For the first time, he was beginning to realize that his arrogance had cost him more than just a sale. Sophie, sensing the tension in the air, took a deep breath and turned to Ethan once again. "Ethan, I don't know how to thank you," she said quietly, her voice filled with emotion. "This means more to me than you'll ever know." Ethan smiled, his eyes filled with warmth. "You don't need to thank me, Sophie. Just keep being the person you are. That's all the thanks I need." For a moment, the two stood there in silence, the weight of everything that had happened hanging in the air. Sophie felt a sense of peace wash over her, a peace she hadn't felt in years. She had spent so long working hard, raising her children, and never asking for much. Now, for the first time in her life, she was being given something extraordinary. And it wasn't just a car. It was a recognition that her kindness and integrity had made a difference. As the day drew to a close, Sophie found herself reflecting on the events that had unfolded. Ethan's generosity had taken her completely by surprise, but it also reminded her of something important, that the way we treat others can have a profound impact on our own lives. And sometimes, that impact comes back to us in ways we could never have imagined. The showroom, once filled with tension, now seemed lighter. The staff, who had witnessed the exchange, were left in awe of the young boy who had walked in dressed simply just days before and now stood as an example of humility and wisdom. Sophie's heart swelled with a mix of emotions, gratitude, disbelief, and the overwhelming realization that perhaps, just perhaps, she did deserve this moment of recognition. And as for Ethan, he knew this was just the beginning. The gift wasn't just a reward for Sophie's kindness. It was a reminder that in a world often filled with judgment and superficiality, real value comes from the heart. And for that, he felt a quiet sense of satisfaction, knowing that Sophie's life, like his own, was about to change for the better. Sophie stood in her small, cozy apartment, staring at the set of car keys in her hand. The reality of what had happened earlier that day was slowly sinking in, but it still felt surreal. She had been given a Ferrari by a teenager. It was the kind of story you'd read about in a magazine, something that seemed so far removed from her own life. Yet here she was, holding the keys to a car worth more than her entire apartment. It was overwhelming, to say the least. She placed the keys on the small kitchen table and sank into a chair, her hands trembling slightly. Could she really accept such a gift? The rational part of her brain was screaming that it was too much, that no one deserved a luxury car just for being nice to someone. But then, there was another part of her, a quieter, softer voice, that whispered she had worked hard for years, never expecting anything in return. Maybe, just maybe, this was the universe's way of rewarding her for everything she had endured. Sophie glanced toward the small bedroom where her two boys, Jason and Liam, were fast asleep. They had no idea what had happened that day. No idea that their mother was now the owner of a car most people could only dream of. She couldn't help but wonder how their lives would change because of this. She had always prided herself on being independent, on working hard for everything she had. But now, things were different. This wasn't just about her anymore. As she sat in the quiet of her apartment, Sophie began to reflect on the years of struggle and sacrifice that had led her to this point. Raising two boys as a single mother was never easy. The long hours at the dealership, the constant worry about making ends meet, the pressure to keep it all together, it had taken its toll. But through it all, she had never complained. She had always believed in the value of hard work and kindness. Now, for the first time, she was being asked to accept something in return, and that was what troubled her most. The next morning, Sophie woke up feeling a mixture of excitement and anxiety. She dressed the boys for school, packed their lunches, and tried to keep her mind off the decision that weighed heavily on her heart. After dropping them off, she found herself driving back to the dealership. She didn't know exactly why. Maybe it was because she needed clarity, or maybe it was because she needed to talk to Ethan one more time. Either way, she felt drawn back to the place where everything had changed. When she walked into the dealership, the staff greeted her with smiles that felt a little different than usual. Word had spread quickly about what had happened, and now people looked at her with a new sense of respect. It was strange how everything could shift so dramatically in such a short amount of time. Sophie headed straight for Ethan's office, her mind racing with thoughts of what she would say. As she approached the door, she found Ethan sitting at his desk, casually flipping through some paperwork. He looked up when he saw her, a warm smile spreading across his face. "Sophie, I was hoping you'd come by," he said, motioning for her to take a seat. "How are you feeling?" Sophie sat down, her heart still heavy with indecision. I don't know, Ethan," she admitted, her voice quiet. "This is all so much. I've never had anything like this happen to me before. I don't even know if I can accept it." Ethan listened patiently, his expression thoughtful. "I understand," he said after a moment. "It's a big gift, but it's not just about the car, Sophie. It's about recognizing the good in people. You showed me kindness when I needed it most, and that's something that should be rewarded. I know it feels overwhelming, but you deserve this." Sophie shook her head slightly, still unsure. "But what if I don't? What if it's too much? I've always worked hard for what I have, and this feels like I didn't earn it." Ethan leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk as he spoke. "Sophie, sometimes life gives us gifts that we don't expect. That doesn't mean we didn't earn them. You've worked hard your whole life, and you've done it with integrity and kindness. That's worth more than any amount of money or hard work. You've earned this, even if it doesn't feel that way right now." His words struck a chord in Sophie. She had spent so many years believing that the only things worth having were the things you worked for. But maybe, just maybe, there was another way to look at it. Maybe kindness and generosity were also things that could come back to you in ways you never expected. Ethan could see the conflict in her eyes and continued speaking. "I know it's not easy to accept help or generosity when you're used to doing everything on your own, but think about it this way. By accepting this gift, you're allowing someone else the opportunity to give. And giving is just as important as receiving." Sophie sat quietly, considering his words. It wasn't just about the car anymore. It was about what the car represented. It was a symbol of Ethan's gratitude, a tangible way for him to show her that kindness mattered. And maybe, just maybe, it was okay to accept that. Finally, Sophie took a deep breath and nodded. "Okay," she said softly. "I'll accept it, but not just for me, for my boys. I want them to see that kindness can come back to you in ways you never expect." Ethan smiled, relief washing over his face. "That's all I wanted to hear, Sophie. I'm glad you see it that way." He stood up and walked around the desk, handing her the official paperwork to transfer the car into her name. "You're going to make a lot of people smile, Sophie." starting with your boys." As Sophie signed the papers, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. She had made the right decision, not just for herself but for her family. And in that moment, she realized that accepting kindness was just as important as giving it. As Sophie's life took an unexpected turn for the better, Paul found himself spiraling in the opposite direction. Ever since the confrontation with Ethan, things hadn't been the same at the dealership. The once confident salesman now walked with a shadow over him. People whispered as he passed by, knowing full well that he had been humiliated in front of the entire staff. He could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on him. But it wasn't just the judgment of others that haunted Paul. It was his own guilt and frustration. Paul sat at his desk, staring blankly at the stack of paperwork in front of him. His once cocky attitude had been replaced by a constant sense of unease. He had been avoiding Ethan and Sophie ever since the incident, trying to keep his head down and pretend that nothing had changed. But deep down, he knew everything had. The shame gnawed at him, a reminder that he had been wrong in the worst way possible. He had treated someone unfairly, and now he was paying the price. Despite his efforts to act as if nothing was wrong, the consequences of his actions soon caught up with him. Mr. Daniels, the dealership's owner, called Paul into his office one morning, the expression on his face serious. Paul felt a knot form in his stomach as he walked into the office, his palms sweaty, knowing this couldn't be good news. Mr. Daniels was a man who valued integrity, and Paul had violated that core principle. "Paul, have a seat," Mr. Daniels said, his tone calm but firm. Paul obeyed, his heart pounding in his chest. The older man looked across the desk at him, his expression unreadable. "We need to talk about what happened a few days ago." Paul swallowed hard. He knew exactly what was coming, but he still tried to defend himself. "Mr. Daniels, I made a mistake," he began, his voice shaky. "I didn't know who Ethan was. If I had known..." Mr. Daniels held up a hand, cutting Paul off mid-sentence. "It's not about who Ethan is, Paul," he said, his voice calm but with a hint of disappointment. "It's about how you treated him. It's about how you treat everyone who walks through those doors." He leaned back in his chair, watching Paul closely. This dealership was built on respect and fairness. We don't judge people by their appearance or their clothes. You know that. Paul felt a sinking sensation in his chest. He had been so focused on status and appearances that he had forgotten the core values of the company. He had let his arrogance cloud his judgment, and now it was coming back to haunt him. "I know, Mr. Daniels," Paul said quietly, lowering his eyes. "I've been with the dealership for years, and I've always..." "Years of service don't excuse this behavior," Mr. Daniels interrupted, his voice firm. "You've put our reputation at risk, and more importantly, you've lost the trust of the people you work with. That's something we can't afford." He paused for a moment, allowing his words to sink in. Effective immediately, "I'm letting you go." The words hit Paul like a punch to the gut. He had expected some kind of reprimand, maybe even a demotion, but not this. His mind raced as he tried to process what had just happened. Fired. After all those years. After everything he had done for the dealership. "Please, Mr. Daniels," Paul pleaded, his voice cracking. "I've made mistakes, but I can do better. Don't fire me. Give me another chance." But Mr. Daniels shook his head, his expression unwavering. "I'm sorry, Paul, but this decision is final. We need to move forward with people who understand and respect the values of this business. You're no longer a good fit here." Paul sat in stunned silence, his mind blank. There was nothing left to say. He had lost everything he had worked for, and there was no one to blame but himself. Slowly, he stood up, his legs feeling weak beneath him. "I understand," he muttered, barely able to look Mr. Daniels in the eye. "Thank you for the opportunity." As he walked out of the office, his head hung low. Paul felt an overwhelming sense of defeat. The other employees watched him as he passed, their faces a mixture of pity and relief. He had always been the one to look down on others, to judge them without a second thought. Now, He was the one on the receiving end of that judgment, and it hurt more than he had ever imagined. When Paul finally reached the parking lot, he stopped for a moment, staring at the dealership that had once been his entire world. How had it come to this? How had he allowed his pride to destroy everything? He had always prided himself on being the best salesman, on knowing how to read people and spot a real buyer. But he had been blind to the fact that there was more to life than money and appearances, blind to the fact that respect and kindness were worth more than any sale. As he got into his car and drove away from the dealership for the last time, Paul felt a wave of regret wash over him. He had been wrong about so many things, and now it was too late to fix any of it. Or was it? That night, Paul sat in his small, dimly lit apartment, nursing a beer as he replayed the events of the past few days in his mind. His arrogance had led to his downfall, and now he was left with nothing. The realization hit him harder than anything else, that his actions had driven him to this point. He had no one to blame but himself. But there was one thought that lingered in the back of his mind, one small glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to change. He couldn't undo what had been done, but perhaps he could find a way to make things right. The first step was admitting that he had been wrong. The second step was figuring out how to fix it. And for the first time in his life, Paul knew that this was a journey he couldn't walk alone. Weeks had passed since Paul's fall from grace, and while life at the dealership carried on without him, his absence was felt in subtle ways. The staff had grown used to his overbearing presence, and now there was a strange quiet in the showroom. Ethan and Sophie, however, had moved forward with their lives, their bond growing stronger as they worked together to bring positive changes to the dealership. The staff admired Sophie for her resilience and newfound position of influence, and Ethan had become a trusted figure, not just for his wealth, but for the way he treated everyone with respect. One sunny afternoon, Sophie was in her office, reviewing the plans for a community event the dealership was hosting. It was Ethan's idea, a way to give back to the local community and invite people from all walks of life to experience the dealership without any pretense or judgment. Sophie had thrown herself into organizing the event, seeing it as an opportunity to make a real difference. She was deep in thought when a knock at her door pulled her attention away from her work. "Come in," she called, expecting one of the staff to need her input on something minor. Instead, she was met with a face she hadn't expected to see again, Paul. He stood in the doorway, looking nothing like the confident, arrogant man she had known before. His shoulders were slouched, his eyes downcast, and he seemed to be carrying the weight of the world on his back. "Paul," Sophie said, surprise evident in her voice. She stood up slowly, unsure of what to say or how to feel. The last time she had seen him, he had stormed out of the dealership, defeated and humiliated. Now, here he was again, though clearly changed. "What are you doing here?" Paul took a hesitant step into the office, his hands nervously fiddling with the edge of his jacket. I came to apologize," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know I don't deserve it, but I need to say it. I was wrong about everything." His eyes flicked up to meet hers, full of guilt and regret. "I treated you horribly, and I treated Ethan even worse. I was so caught up in my own arrogance that I forgot how to treat people with respect." Sophie was quiet for a moment, absorbing his words. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, the pain that came with realizing just how much damage he had done, not only to others, but to himself. She gestured for him to sit down, and he hesitated before taking a seat across from her desk. "Paul, I appreciate you coming here to say that," Sophie said gently. "But an apology is only the first step. What happened between us and with Ethan, it wasn't just about a bad day. It was about the way you treated people for a long time." Paul nodded, his face filled with shame. "I know," he said quietly. "I've spent these past few weeks thinking about it. I lost everything because of how I acted, and I deserve that. But I don't want to stay that person. I want to change. I need to change." He looked up at Sophie, his eyes pleading. "I'm asking for a second chance. not just here, but in life. I don't want to be the man I was. Sophie felt a pang of sympathy for Paul. She knew what it was like to struggle, to face challenges, though hers had been of a different kind. But she also knew that real change came from within, and it wasn't something that happened overnight. Change is hard, Paul, she said softly. It takes time and effort, and it starts with understanding that the world doesn't owe you anything just because you've realized your mistakes. You have to earn your way back. Paul nodded, his face tight with emotion. I know. I'm willing to do whatever it takes. I've already started volunteering at the community center. It's not much, but it's a start. I've been trying to give back, to do something good for once. Sophie smiled slightly, impressed by his admission. That's a good start, she said. But you have to keep going. You can't just expect people to forgive and forget right away. It's about proving to yourself and to others that you've truly changed. At that moment, the door to the office opened again, and Ethan walked in. He froze for a second when he saw Paul sitting there, but quickly recovered, his usual calm demeanor returning. Paul, Ethan said, his voice neutral but curious. What brings you here? Paul stood up, his posture awkward and tense. Ethan, I came to apologize. I know I was wrong, and I know that I don't deserve forgiveness, but I had to say it. I treated you unfairly, and I'm sorry. Ethan studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He had grown up watching people's actions speak louder than their words, and he had learned that real change was something you showed, not just something you said. Apologies are important, Ethan said carefully, but what you do from here on out matters more. Are you ready to prove that you've changed? Paul nodded eagerly. Yes, I'm ready. I've already started trying to make things right in my own life. Volunteering, giving back. I just want a chance to show that I'm not the person I used to be. Ethan glanced at Sophie, and she gave him a slight nod of encouragement. They both knew that giving someone a second chance wasn't just about offering forgiveness. It was about holding them accountable to the person they wanted to become. All right, Ethan said, turning back to Paul. I'll give you that chance, but it's up to you to follow through. Paul's eyes filled with relief. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I won't let you down. I promise. Sophie watched as Paul left the office, a small sense of hope blooming inside her. Maybe people could change. Maybe even someone like Paul could find a way to turn his life around. She glanced at Ethan, who was watching her thoughtfully. Do you think he can really do it? She asked. Ethan smiled faintly. That's up to him, he replied. But I believe in giving people the opportunity to try. We all need that sometimes. Sophie nodded, feeling a sense of closure she hadn't expected. Things were different now, better. And as she prepared for the upcoming community event, she realized that this was just the beginning of something new. The dealership, once a place of status and exclusivity, was now becoming a place of connection and kindness. And that was a change she was proud to be a part of. The day of the community event arrived, and the dealership was buzzing with energy. Families from all walks of life came through the doors, welcomed by Sophie, Ethan, and the rest of the staff. There were no judgments, no assumptions, just a sense of community and shared experience. Ethan watched as children marveled at the cars. Parents mingled with the staff, and laughter filled the air. This was a vision he had always wanted for the dealership. A place where everyone could feel valued, no matter who they were or what they had. As the sun began to set and the event wound down, Sophie found herself standing beside Ethan, watching the last few families leave with smiles on their faces. We did good today, she said softly, a sense of pride swelling in her chest. Ethan nodded, his gaze thoughtful. Yeah, we did, he agreed. But this is just the beginning. There's so much more we can do. Sophie smiled, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for how far they had come. I'm ready for whatever comes next, she said. And she meant it. As they stood there together, the future felt bright. Not just for the dealership, but for everyone who had been a part of its transformation. And somewhere, Paul was starting his own journey of redemption, knowing that it would be a long road, but one worth traveling. Enjoy the story. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Share your thoughts in the comments and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next thrilling episode. See you in our next video. Take care.